Gentleman yields back. Mr. Pownter, I was sitting here trying to figure out whether anything could be more inherently predictable than the decennial census. I really am struggling to think of something that you see that far in advance that's coming. So, not to ask this in too sophisticated of a way, but how the hell did we get here if we know it's coming every 10 years? How do you get on a critical watch list?
Well, the thing that's a bit frustrating is the same thing happened in 2010, and we actually were involved in that in 2010. So that's when we canceled the handheld project. This committee held multiple hearings on the overruns there and the eventual cancellation. The interesting comment that Secretary Ross talked about, 80% of the money's going from beyond 2018. From an IT perspective, that should not be the case. We should start early, plan more appropriately, get the right contracts in place, and deliver. What happens with the decennial historically, and it's going to happen again, can we get this done late and secure it late? Yes. But you know what it's going to be? It's going to be a higher cost. You pay a premium for doing everything late. I would have major concerns about the 15.6 and still hitting that, even with the 10% when you look at the IT management of this. The thing that's good is having the Commerce Department's governance and oversight, I think will greatly help. But we still haven't changed the basic management of how we're doing things at the Census Bureau. So we would still have concerns about additional cost overruns going forward. But it's not acceptable that we repeat the same sins of the past that we do every 10 years with the decennial.
It's really hard to explain to the same people that you're trying to convince to voluntarily comply. Which leads to my next question. What are the impediments, Mr. Goldenkopf? What are the impediments to what I call voluntary compliance, although I'm sure that's not the right technical term?
Sure. There are a number of barriers. One that was already mentioned was just a declining civic engagement. People are increasingly disconnected from the government. So that requires trust, building trust between the Census Bureau and the public. There's also a cultural divide. When, and was already mentioned too, when the government comes knocking on your door, the census is sometimes seen as not something that's done for you or on your behalf. It's sometimes seen as something that's done to you. It's not always seen in a positive light. Then there's structural barriers, people living in makeshift housing, non-conventional housing, people doubling up, people living in basements and converted attics. So they're just physically hard to find. There are language barriers out there, so just reaching those folks is difficult as well. And this is why all this upfront work is so important and why the Census Bureau is at the point that it is right now. It's very difficult to make up for either funding that was not provided or time that's already elapsed. You can get behind the curve very quickly.
Well, accepting the fact that we can't do all of the pre-planning for 2020 that needed to be done in 2012, 2013, so the best we can do is the 2030 census there with specific reference to the 2020 that's coming up. If I heard the testimony right, there's an opening in the Census Director's office. So I'm going to start with Ms. Gupta. If you were the Census Director, you got to do one thing, you got to do it today, upon the chance that Mr. Ross or his folks may be listening, what is the single most important thing you would do today for the 2020 census?
It's hard to say a single thing. I think a couple things need to happen all at once. The IT infrastructure needs to be tested clearly for all of the reasons that have been previously stated. And I think that the partnership and communications campaigns need to be out there starting in the next couple of months. They've got to ramp up this whole infrastructure in order to really educate folks about why it's important to be counted and to overcome some of the real concerns around mistrust in government and cybersecurity. And so, I want to add that when the Secretary was testifying, he said that he anticipated 800 partnership specialists, which is well below the 2010 number of 3,800. And so those plans are still inadequate. And I just think that right now, There is a lot of concern that the hardest to count communities are not going to be adequately counted, and that will result in a failed census even with the 1.6 billion if allocated. And so there has to be an immediate investment in that infrastructure and kind of real planning around it, just as there is with the IT.
Ms. Rice, what's the single most, or two if you want? What needs to be done today, given the fact that we can't change the lack of pre-planning?
I really think the IT infrastructure has to be in place. We don't want to be in a position where we were in 2010, when they had to revert to a paper-based operation at the last minute. And they didn't have they had some infrastructure there and they had to build on it, and it was a problem. There were backlogs, and the office sizes weren't compatible for a paper operation. I mean, it was just trickled down, all the problems. They got it done, but it wasn't pretty. So getting that IT infrastructure in place.
Mr. Fowler, you can't use the word infrastructure. What would you do?
So with the IT, and that's my world, Mr. Chairman, I would say those 43 systems need to be delivered and secured. And, we have this data in our testimony that looks all neat, and it's very difficult to get a handle on where all those systems are from a delivery point of view, integration and security. That needs to be managed weekly. Someone needs to dog that weekly in terms of what we got done, what remains the next week, and are we going to hit those dates? There's key dates in early 2018 that are going to be key to getting this stuff delivered to be included in the end-to-end test. So you have to dog the 43 systems from a security perspective. Chairman, Representative Hurd's comments about the ATO process, it's fine to bring in people, but you know what? You need to actually do the assessments, and you need to fix the vulnerabilities, and you need to sign off on the ATOs. That needs to be managed weekly to ensure that that gets done and we don't have a major breach.
Mr. Goldenkoff, last question. The diminution of public trust didn't happen overnight. It's not going to be remedied overnight. What is something that perhaps the members of Congress haven't thought about, or what's something you would do to try to restore some modicum of public trust so we can raise the voluntary compliance rate in 2020?
Sure. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't think there's anything new, and I would certainly be leery of trying anything that has not been used before at this point, just because it would be one more risk for the Bureau to have to manage. What I think needs to be done is focused on the tried and true methods, things that are known to work, and I would point to the partnership specialists and the whole communication and outreach campaign. The partnership specialists are so critical for engaging the different people that they represent, their different stakeholder groups. And they're the ones who create that trust. They are the trusted voices. If Secretary Ross or any of us goes up on TV or encourages people to respond to the census, it's not going to have the same level of response as people who know the community, your local minister, your school principal. It was mentioned before that the Census Bureau hopes to hire as many as 800 partnership specialists. That sounds like a large number, but if you just look at the workload, if you think of there are over 3,000 counties in this country, that's a huge workload for them. It's a three-dimensional issue. They have to cover both the physical geography, the different channels of communication, plus the deep dive into all the different communities. And so I think a focus then on the partnership campaign and making sure that that's adequately funded and gets the resources they need will be critical for increasing the count in hard-to-count communities.
Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.